Global warming and climate change are the most pressing threats and challenges to global food security, stability, and development that mankind is facing today. As global warming continues, scientists point out that the world is moving towards a dangerous tipping point by year 2050, the point at which climate change becomes irreversible. The Earth's temperature is changing abruptly, mainly caused by 2 centuries of fossil fuel-based industrialization, urbanization, and agriculture. But even before that year, the Philippines is already experiencing the initial brunt of climate change, and these past weeks, we were given a glimpse of climate change because of the typhoons that are becoming more ferocious and more damaging. Typhoons Ondoy and Pepeng gave the Philippines a more daunting task of convincing the leaders of the developed world to cut their carbon emissions now, to cut deep and early, even before that tipping point of irreversible climate change will be reached in 2050. The Philippine delegation to the climate change negotiations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, headed by Secretary Herson Alvarez, the Presidential Advisor on Global Warming and Climate Change, submitted interventions that call for deep and early cuts by Annex I countries. As directed by President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, the Philippines called for cuts by industrialized countries of more than 30% from 2013 to 2017, more than 50% from 2018 to 2022, and at least 95% by 2050, all from 1990 levels. This Philippine position, which is shared by similarly situated nations of the ASEAN and in the Asia-Pacific region, who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, will be brought by the Philippines forward to Copenhagen in December. In Copenhagen, world leaders will meet at the 15th Conference of Parties to vote for a new climate change treaty when the Kyoto Protocol expires by 2012, and the Philippine delegation will personally make sure that the concerns of the Philippines are integrated into that new protocol for the survival of our people. At the same time, while we convince the rest of the world that industrialized nations must cut their carbon emissions, we must also convince the Filipino people to voluntarily cut emissions, which also addresses the garbage problem that clogged our drainage systems during typhoons, and prepare our communities for climate change disasters. To rationalize and synthesize all government programs into one focused campaign to address climate change, President Arroyo issued Executive Order No. 774 in December 2008, reorganizing the Presidential Task Force on Climate Change, or PTFCC. Under this executive order, the President took chairmanship of the task force, while cabinet secretaries were named as task force members and as head of 17 task groups to help implement various local campaigns against climate change. The Office of the Presidential Advisor on Global Warming and Climate Change was mandated to be the overseer of the task force. However, when typhoons Ondoy and Pepeng ravaged Luzon, which were clear manifestations of climate change, we saw the gaps of the national and local government units in terms of our preparedness to climate change disasters. We saw the lack of a national plan on climate change. And so today, We mark a milestone in Philippine history as the President signs the Climate Change Act of 2009, the first law in the Asian region that will create a government agency that will deal directly with climate change. This law seeks to mainstream climate change into government policy formulation from the national government down to the local government units by establishing a national framework strategy and program on climate change, a comprehensive program to ensure that mitigation and adaptation, the two weapons to combat climate change, will be implemented in all levels of government. A product of this framework will be a National Climate Change Action Plan, the country's roadmap for mitigation, with emphasis on voluntary reduction of carbon emissions and adaptation, with special emphasis on disaster risk reduction or DRR, so that the onslaught of climate change is addressed. This bill will also create a Climate Change Commission, an independent and autonomous national government agency attached to the Office of the President, which will give the Philippines sufficient presence for current and future negotiations on climate change in the global front. The Commission will be the sole policy-making body of the government and tasked to coordinate, monitor, and evaluate the programs and action plans relating to climate change. It will be headed by the President as chairperson, assisted by 3 commissioners, one of whom shall serve as vice chairperson of the Commission and executive director of a climate change office. The Commission will have an advisory board composed of the secretaries of the Department of Agriculture, Energy, Environment and Natural Resources, Education, Foreign Affairs, Health, Interior and Local Government, National Defense, Public Works and Highways, Science and Technology, Social Welfare and Development, Trade and Industry, and Transportation and Communications. The Advisory Board will also have the Director General of the National Economic and Development Authority, the Director General of the National Security Council, and the Chairperson of the National Commission on the Role of Filipino Women. To ensure that the National Climate Change Action Plan will translate into local climate change action plan, the Advisory Board will also have as members the Presidents of the League of Provinces, the League of Cities, the League of Municipalities, and the Liga ng mga Barangay. And because climate change affects us all, it will need the support of all sectors of society. So the Advisory Board will invite representatives from the academe, the business sector, non-governmental organizations, and from the disaster risk reduction community as members. Through this law, the Philippines will reduce its carbon emissions and move towards a low-carbon economy, while adequately preparing our people to respond to disasters and adapt to changes in the world's climate. As climate change becomes a pressing global issue, the signing of the Climate Change Act by President Arroyo signals an immediate first step and a direct response of the Philippine government to the danger of climate change.